Welcome to Data Revolution. What should everyone be asking? We have a wonderful panel today to discuss and debate this, and I am sure that many of you too have been thinking about this question, not least because data science has been projected into all of our lives as we seek to understand the COVID pandemic. So a wonderfully timed session that we could never have predicted back when we first submitted it, but it was already an urgent session, an urgent discussion then. So we're really delighted, even more so, to be having it today. I'm Tracy Brown, I'm the Director of Sense About Science, and this is something that has been of great concern to us. Data science, machine learning, modelling for analysis and prediction have quite rapidly and with very little debate about their reliability and quality entered into decisions that affect all our lives, from criminal justice to education and to pandemic planning. We are told regularly there's a data science revolution, and indeed it certainly looks that way in banking, in economic forecasting, distribution and logistics, medicine and the delivery of healthcare. We have now 10-year real-time economic surveys, welfare, justice, transport, organising our cities, monitoring air, oceans, space, soil, and the path of bees to the path of hurricanes. Data science is a very big part of decision-making. Now, as somebody who has worked for many years with the public and with policymakers and journalists to seek to equip them with good and useful questions to ask about the evidence in our lives, you can imagine that this is something of concern and interest. Sense About Science works at the sharp end. We deal with things like infant heart surgery, the publication of clinical trial data, and things like how to analyse the way that we reduce CO2. As a society, looking at data, understanding what tools do we need to ask the critical questions if we ourselves are not the experts, but we're being asked to partake in decisions. We equip people to arm themselves against hype and against bust and against magical thinking. So we don't want to absorb things and take on decisions that will lead us in the wrong direction, not just hype to allow hype to enter the discussion, but also to make sure that we take the opportunities to benefit from all of the new power that comes with data analytics, modelling of complex variables, and so on. And one of the things that has been of greatest concern to me as someone who has campaigned long and hard in the area of medical science for us to have informed patients and for us to have transparency and accountability. It seems really strange to me that so much progress has been made, that the speed of change is so rapid in data science, and yet we are back where we were in medicine in the 1970s, in not really being able to ask the kind of questions that we need to ask to deal with things critically. Rather like we were perhaps in engineering, also around that time, before people began to actually document the handover of technologies. And now that we have those things which make life safer and mean that we know what we're getting. But in data science, do we really know what we're getting? Have we begun to ask those sorts of questions? Well, I'm delighted that we aren't the only people who are concerned by this. It's a concern that we began to share with the International Network of Government Science Advice, and also with Elsevier as one of the biggest curators of data, and with many other people around the world over the last couple of years. Because we're all concerned that we take those opportunities and that we do so in a way that ensures accountability, particularly when we're looking at making sometimes life and death decisions for people and so giving them life and death related advice. So I'm delighted to say that we actually have a kind of growing team of people around the world who are concerned with this, but I would say not nearly enough of them and not nearly enough effort is going into this. What we have done is produce Data Science, a Guide for Society, which we launched last year at the INGSA conference. And that has drawn a lot of attraction, particularly from journalists and others who are interested in asking penetrating questions. What that does is it looks at three crucial questions that we should be asking and all the other questions that sit behind those. And I just want to give you a quick run through some of those questions to give you a bit of a flavour of just how much asking needs to be done. So where does it come from? Where does the data come from? What's the actual question that it's answering? And was the data designed actually to answer that question? Or have we gone looking around and developed the question from the data? What we're looking at the representative of the population that we're trying to understand, whether that's a population of microbes or population of people, and what type of conclusion are we seeking to draw? Have we ensured that the relationships that we're observing are actually real? And this leads to the second set of questions. What's being assumed here? Have we actually measured the right thing? We measure proxies quite often. We measure things like people withdrawing or claiming unemployment benefits to understand how many people have jobs and how many people don't. But have we measured the right thing for the kind of stuff we're trying to understand? As everybody famously knows, the apocryphal tale of Google flu, where actually it seemed that the particular searches that Google was noticing across the world with the spread of flu a few years ago were not the things that predicted the path of flu. Are we eliminating human prejudice from decision making? Are we actually making better decisions as a result of the way that we're using data in decision making? And how are we comparing that? When we have a new medicine, we look at whether it's better than the treatment we already have. How do we do the same thing in data science? And are we actually in danger, in some cases with automation, of rolling out human prejudices on a very large scale? And can the results truly be generalized? We have a lot of questions to ask about that. There are a lot of things that are developed in one context and taken and applied in another. There are observations that academics make in their research and are horrified to find that they're being rolled out by authorities who make decisions about benefits, for example, and welfare. And these are the sorts of stories that are coming across my desk regularly. People concerned that what they developed in one context is being used by another, often commercially and quite inappropriately. Are we sure that the things that we're looking at are the right things, but also that the things we're not looking at are actually irrelevant? Are we missing something big? So many of us know that the use of the flu modelling that we've had to rely upon for the pandemic planning for COVID has had some real big shortcomings, and we've known those shortcomings, and that we've known how important it is to understand the specifics of what we're looking at. We could do nothing else during the early stages of the coronavirus spread. We could do nothing else, but we at least were aware of those shortcomings. We need to know what variables are missing. And finally, can it bear the weight we want to put on it? As always in areas of research and evidence that we use in decision making, whether that's in our own lives or in national policy or global policy, as always, we should be asking, what's the nature of the question we want to ask? Is it the case that, I'm just making a judgment about which shampoo is going to make my hair more shiny, in which case I can have 3 of my friends give me advice, but if we're wanting to make a decision about how to achieve, for example, the CO2 reduction, the reduction in CO2 emissions that has been signed up to in the Paris Accord, can we really put the weight on those data? Do we need to do something to make them more robust, for example? Those are the sorts of things we need to be asking. Can it bear the weight? How well does the model actually perform? Are we in danger of using models to produce very precise numbers that then give us a false reassurance that we really know what's going on? Again, something I think has been raised regularly throughout the COVID crisis. So there are so many questions that we should be asking. And I'm so concerned that we actually haven't really been thinking about who in society should be asking them. Because of course our journalists should be asking them, our policymakers should be asking them, that there are so many people involved in the decision-making process. There are researchers who are relying on the research of others. There are researchers who are relying on models. There are clinicians who are relying on models produced by researchers. There are procurement specialists in government having to make decisions about whether or not something can be rolled out on a national scale. They're having to buy stuff and wonder what it is they're buying. Well, I'm absolutely delighted that to help us think about who and how we can start asking those questions, I have got today an absolutely fantastic panel, not least, in fact, Professor Peter Gluckman, who is, I believe, a little bit behind the New Zealand introduction of standards in the procurement of data science applications. And I'm sure he'll have something to say about that. So we're joined today by Peter Gluckman, who's chair of the International Network for Government Science Advice. He's was also the first New Zealand chief scientist and went up until very recently. and he's the president-elect of the International Science Council. I'm joined also by Cosmina Dorobantu, who is the Deputy Programme Director for Public Policy at the Alan Turing Institute, and her speciality is international economics and econometrics. So I think highly relevant to our thinking today of the importance of asking the right questions in decision-making. And she's particularly interested in the use of unconventional data in a decision-making context. And so I think right at the cutting edge of the sorts of issues that we're seeing. I'm also joined by Michiel Coleman, who is the Senior Vice President of Information Industry Relations and Academic Ambassador for Elsevier. He is the previous president of the International Publishers Association. And I should also say, Michiel has been a great brain in my thinking as we've developed the Data Science Guide, thinking very socially about the issues that we are addressing, and not just from the point of view of data curation. And we have, after hearing from them, they're going to give you a bit of an introduction to how they see these issues. We have Marie Boran, who is an Irish Times columnist and a regular writer. Many of you will know her work in The New Scientist and many other publications. She writes about science and tech, AI and digital culture. So she thinks much more broadly around these subjects and asks really difficult questions. And she's actually understands an awful lot more of it than many of us do. And I can only look at her in great admiration for the things that she takes and makes simple. So I'm delighted that she's going to have a critical view to share on what our different panelists are saying today and to ask some challenging questions. And then it'll be over to you. So please do start putting your questions across in the chat. They're going to be coming through to us in the studio, and we'll be able to respond to them throughout the discussion that we have afterwards. And perhaps some of our speakers will respond as we go. So please do start putting those in. I should say to you, put your name and your organisation so that we can see where you're coming from and also refer to you for your question. So I'm looking forward very much to that discussion today. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Peter Gluckman.
Thank you, Tracy. Your introduction, in fact, covers all the remarks I was going to make, so I might stop now and go back to bed because it's 2 o'clock in the morning in New Zealand. But seriously, I think you're right. There's been far too little critique within the science community of the issues of big data-driven science. We live in a world where the nature of information in general is changing rapidly. And there are big implications in that change in information structure. First, perhaps not entirely irrelevant to this discussion, is the new disease of misinformation and disinformation, and big data in its various forms offers new opportunities for such misinformation and disinformation in its somewhat obtuse structure. Secondly, as you've already implicated, we have an enormous shift in the conduct of much science and its communication, where data and its associated infrastructure starts to rule in a culture, I think, of what we might even go as far as to say is sometimes a pseudo-objectivity. Hypothesis testing has been replaced by big data pattern recognition, with many black boxes in the forms of algorithms. Good data quality has been replaced by saying big data alone will deal with quality issues, and small effects can be claimed to be of major importance, as has been the case in much of genomic association research. At times, I wonder whether we will find out that in the latter half of the 21st century, that this has been the equivalent almost to p-hacking, where we look for associations and patterns just by repeated examination, and we need deep statistical reflection on what tools and in what situations inference should be made. What is data? After all, data is not knowledge. Data is what we can measure with all the flaws, as you've pointed out, about its collection, as we try and study phenomena and answer questions that we set. And we study phenomena to try and have some sense of reality. And it's those phenomena and understanding of those, which is what evidence is. And we need that evidence to make some decisions. There's a step, but therefore between data collection, data analysis, and what is evidence that is appropriate for for answering questions, for making decisions. Increasingly, data is put into models, and these models try and describe systems. The danger is when we are prepared to put aside human judgment and elevate numbers and models to exclusive roles in decision making. And I think that's the really important point to make, that what we have been doing in this is elevating the rhetorical power of numbers and models to almost exclusive roles in decision making. Models try and describe systems, but systems by definition always have many unknowns. And the models we use are designed on the prior assumptions we have about how those systems might be modeled to describe reality. So models are really models of our perceptions of reality. The assumptions along the way may not be obvious. The interrelationships are often non-linear, but the relationships we may not fully understand, and we may guess in the model about those relationships. The data itself can be non-representative, and we tend to model open systems as if they're closed systems. There's many things that we need to think about in those simple statements. And all of that comes along too often in rather dogmatic statements of uncertainty, of certainty. We've seen that previously in pandemics. In the 1976 swine flu modelling, which made very dogmatic statements about what the future would mean. I think the UK saw that in the foot and mouth pandemic. We've seen, and we're now seeing these issues playing out in the public debates over COVID modelling. Modelling, which in general is occurring and being used without any attempt in the rush to use these models at peer review and dissecting out in a critical way the assumptions made within them. Probabilities are often missing. Uncertainties beyond the model remain unstated because factors of importance may have been left out. Think about some of the models that were used in the early days that made gross assumptions about human behavior or ignored human behavior altogether. Data sets can be biased, as we've seen in facial recognition data sets. And the inferential risk that Heather Douglas talks about so much in relationship to what you might call normal science is even bigger in the obtuseness of big data science. Numbers and graphs can be remarkably rhetorical. Remember Al Gore's graph in The Unfortunate Truth? The rhetorical power of a single graph. Rhetoric is important, let's not deny it, but we must be careful to understand the power of big data and models to be very rhetorical, but not good for communicating uncertainty, for integrating knowledge behind the data, and for hiding its biases. Models in the end, as others have written about, are trading off between generality, precision, and realism. In COVID, epidemiological models have been extensively used, but the quality and purpose of the models has been highly variable. Some trying to force political decisions, some attempt to understand behavioral elements for intervention, some models recognize diversity in human behaviors, others have been very simplistic and based on very naive assumptions. Gross assumptions have been made, for example, in the early days about what would be the patterns of human immunity. Remarkably, yet very little has been communicated, as I see it, about the levels of uncertainty in the models that were presented. Remarkably precise claims have been made for predictions and then used and inferred by politicians. Of course, models are essential and useful, but less hubris and more reflection is needed. We're early in this journey with big data. And as society, we appear enthused by the hype associated with it, which the scientists contribute to. But let's think through the limits of it and be more demanding of understanding the issues of any model, any big data, AI, or machine learning claims. Yes, models are of the moment. They're critically important, but let's think through their use much more carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Wow, that's a really challenging opening for Cosmina to come in and to think about some of those issues, I'm sure, are things that affect our work. So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. We're looking forward now to your presentation, Cosmina.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me and for the introduction. What I would want to do today is to take you a little bit down, the route of bringing this to light. What we mean when we say that data matters. Now, I sit within the Alan Turing Institute, which is the National Institute for Data Science and AI in the UK. And I help run the Public Policy Program, which is a research program that brings together academics that are interested in working with the government to figure out how we can build the right tools for the government so that it takes advantage of the latest generation of data-intensive technologies. But more importantly, how we build the ethical foundations for the use of these tools in the public sector. Now, what is the big dream when it comes to data science and AI in a public sector context? Well, the big dream is that data science and AI have enormous potential to make government better. Governments collect huge amounts of data about citizens, and one can dream of a world where that data can be used to tailor education to the needs of each child, to reduce street crime, to fit healthcare to each patient, to alleviate the cost of financial crisis, to prevent traffic deaths, and to intervene early for children at risk. You can imagine thousands of other scenarios, and all of this could help in our dream vision make government more efficient, fair, responsive, and sustainable. Of course, the reality is very different from the dream, and I wanted to highlight to you what the reality is. And I'll pick one of these topics that I highlighted here today, which is intervening early for children at risk. And again, the dream is that maybe we can have machine learning algorithms that could identify which children are going to be at risk, and we can intervene early so they can be prevented from harm. The reality is different from the dream, and at least within the United Kingdom, what the reality is that local authorities have had to deal with years and years of austerity and cuts. They've seen their budget reduced, and they're struggling to hire social care workers who could do the investigations that would be able to pinpoint children at risk. Within this context, they're being put under tremendous pressure to go out to private sector providers and purchase machine learning algorithms that would be able to take on some of this work and identify children who are at risk. We've seen a lot of these local authorities come to the Turing to ask us what they should do. It's usually the IT administrator that gets tasked with procuring this contract, who knows very little about children or machine learning. So we ended up writing a report, a very substantial report that looks, it's an ethics review of machine learning in children's social care. And I'm citing it at the bottom of the slides, mostly to give an idea to policymakers as to what are the questions that they should be asking. But at the most basic level, using machine learning in children's social care raises two important questions. The first one is, should we be doing this? And that is a question that requires us to examine the ethical criteria that would make the use of machine learning in children's social care justifiable. The second question is, can we do this? I'll focus on the second question, not because it is more important. The first one, it is crucial, and it should definitely be asked before we move on into thinking how we can implement this. But when we ask the question of, can we do this right? There are three factors that we need to consider. We need to look at the data that we have. We need to look at the models that we could build, and we need to look at the implementation. I'll focus on the data today, just because of time constraints. But all of these different elements are treated quite at length in the report that we wrote. So let's think about this. If a local authority in the UK wants to build a machine learning algorithm that identifies children at risk, what data do they have access to? We'll have data that they have collected from their social workers who have examined problematic cases. So they have the data that shows where there have been issues that were investigated in the past, basically. So what do we want from this data if we actually want to create something that's usable? Well, both Tracy and Peter have mentioned this. We want it to be representative. Does it mirror the makeup of the population? And the problem here is that underrepresentation of groups can lead to skewed outputs. A machine learning model would overestimate the risk for members of an overrepresented group in the data and underestimate the risk for members of the underrepresented group. So in other words, if you have a child from a relatively poor minority background, they're likely to get a higher risk assigned by this machine learning model than a white kid in a middle-class household. We need to ask questions about relevancy. Does the data provide a comprehensive view of what I'm trying to model? And what is interesting here, in writing this report, we consulted a lot with social care workers and also with families, just to understand their perspective on it. What is interesting when you think about relevancy, there are a ton of interesting questions to ask, but when you think about relevancy of data in a social care context, is that data collected by local authorities and child protection agencies tends to focus on negative factors, so that intervention concentrates exclusively on the aspect of protecting children from harm. What that data leaves out and fails to note are the paths of improved family life, and by doing so, it presents an incomplete picture. It misses out what makes for a good, stable, and healthy family life, and that is a huge omission besides many others, many other omissions in the data. We also have to ask whether the data is recent. How up to date is it? There's so many changes and tweaks in children's social care. For example, in the UK, the threshold required for a child to be put into care is changing all the time. So relying on that data to create a model would necessarily create all sorts of inaccuracies. And finally, speaking of accuracies, we need to ask of the data if it is accurate, and are there elements of human bias or error in the data? Now, when we're talking to social workers and the families that we brought together to consult on this piece of work, the social workers were telling us that they're often tired at the end of the day and pressed for time when they need to enter the case notes that they have collected during the day. They also are construed by their IT systems that make them enter data in drop-down menus or categories, which forces them to lump cases together that don't necessarily belong together. And also the incentives that they have for data collection influence the data that they're recorded. In the UK, we had the Troubled Families Program, which was a program that used the payment for results model, which incentivized positive outcomes in the data. The social care workers had to record positive outcomes, and families often felt under pressure to report positive outcomes because otherwise they wouldn't have continued to receive the financial support that they were receiving. So this is the reality when you're trying to build a machine learning model like this, especially when you're looking at the data that you're trying to build. Now, I don't want to say by presenting that reality that the dream that we had at the beginning is impossible to achieve. But what I want to say is that there's a very long road from the reality to the dream. And it's an interesting and necessary road that we must take. And starting these conversations and the work of, that we're doing ourselves, and that I'm sure many of our listeners are doing and embarking on, is key to getting this right. So that's all from me. I look forward to the questions at the end.
Thank you. And what a fantastic example to use. There are so many other questions that immediately come up as you took us through that, that I'm sure we're going to be picking up in some of the discussion. I'm about to introduce our next panelist, but before I do, I just want to say, please do feel in asking questions and sending things through. There is no dumb question on this subject. There are just so many questions that we've all had that we felt, we perhaps shouldn't be asking. I know that there are major politicians around the world who have announced big data strategies worth millions of euros and haven't got a clue what big data actually means. So please understand there is no wrong question on this subject. It's actually the problem that we're facing, that we all feel like we should know more than we do. And this is a great opportunity for people to ask as they find. Please put your questions forward. Okay, Michael Coleman, delighted to have you with us again on this subject.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. So a bit at the last spur of the moment, I decided to go to Trieste. So I'm actually in Trieste itself, and very impressed how the local organizers of 2020 have been presenting us with this blended model of virtual and on-site. And I'm very happy to be here in this panel and to give the perspective from the publishing industry, which I think nowadays is more accurately called the information industry. So we do produce a lot of data. So the role of the publishers, and maybe I will frame it in this way today, is part of, I would say, a recurring discussion of platforms versus publishers. And to get the point across is that platforms, it's user-generated data, very little responsibility taken by the platforms for the content. Good examples we all know, Google, Facebook, Microsoft. They are, as a result, custodians of 1.2 thousand petabytes of people's information. It's almost shocking. And of course, they stand accused of influencing political discussions and promoting hate speech and inequality. And by contrast, there you have the publishers. They commission content. The content is curated by their staff, editors, peer reviewers, of course, and others. And they try to take as much responsibility for the content, for the knowledge, as they can, and turn this information into trusted knowledge through the peer review process, but also to address research integrity, plagiarism, and data fabrication, erratas, retractions, etc. At the same time, publishers also, of course, fight for the freedom to publish, because we also sometimes operate in situations where there's censorship, for instance, in certain political situations. Now, the importance of quality control is even more important today than ever. And we hear often as people say, well, we don't just want to read an article, we want to get the knowledge out of that article. And we want to find exactly the right piece of information at the right time. And we already mentioned, the Corona crisis many times, and it introduced also for us, I would call it an infodemic. Like every 20 days, every 3 weeks, we were, the publishers were flooded by 23,000 manuscripts that had to be turned into publications as fast as we could. So there's a huge pressure on speed. And what we've seen is that preprints, which is the very earliest stage of an article, where there has been no peer review whatsoever, they moved to the forefront, and they actually introduced a certain, I would say, peer review light. And elsewhere, we manage also a series of preprints. So this is not us against the preprints, because but that is an interesting development. At the same time, the journals, they were fast tracking the peer review process and papers as well. And editors felt they were under intense pressure not to miss anything. I don't know if you've heard Richard Horton. He was here virtually at ESOF. So, I mean, he talked a lot about, the role of the Lancet during the Corona crisis. And then questions came up. So if there's so much information out there and it's so difficult to kind of ramp up this human intervention, which we've been relying on so far, should we just, move over to AI? And I would advise against it, by the way. And so we did see that, a typical data set with COVID information is linked to like 60,000 papers. So it's an enormous amount of information there. So, and that, of course, touches on all the information out there. It's trusted information, but then it's being used. And of course, we've heard it before. Today, with the rise of the online platforms and the way information is shared in social media, it often loses its context. It loses its authority, and it loses the expertise credentials. We are very aware of the echo chambers. And we've also seen that the algorithm approach really drives polarization, also for scientific research. So what is picked out there of scientific research and then kind of amplified by algorithms is not something humans would have done, and it's very unbalanced. And we see that the COVID-19 crisis, it's not like a great solution for everything, far from it. We see that policymakers are in intense pressure to make the right decisions versus the approach for science, where we want to take as much as we can to reach a certain level of consensus. And the health policies, they can't wait either. So they require much more than just a vaccine. So here, I think it really focuses on the importance of openness and transparency. And there were interesting cases, actually, one published by the New England Journal of Medicine, and the other by the Lancet, the Elsevier Journal, were crucial articles for Corona that were later retracted. And people interpreted it, and also made the New York Times, etc., that it showed that peer review was flawed, etc., and it was the end of the traditional journal. But now, when we have a little bit more time to digest and we look back, actually, peer review worked fine, but it was the underlying data set which was actually flawed and not available. So it was much more a case of not being transparent, or not kind of living up to the open science objectives, where data sets are freely available for everybody. And it was not so much the peer review process itself. So what approach do the publishers take? So to increase trust, it's really important to emphasize transparency. The STM organization, this year, 2020, for them, it's the year of research data. So I cannot emphasize that enough. So how can you share research data as easily as possible, often link to journals, or you can link articles to repositories of data. And also, how can you get the data well cited? It's very important. And you see here on the right, so all the steps in research, and traditionally, it's only the final output is the research paper, right, which is being published, and that's it. What we're trying to do now is that all these steps in research, where you start building an experiment, where you have maybe the influence of software, hardware, the data articles, of course, so that all these steps of research are being shared. And that, of course, will give you a far deeper understanding of what's happening in the scientific process, and a clear example of transparency. So to do that, of course, we had to develop our data skills, and it's not, a job for one person. It's a skill set, I think, that everybody needs to develop. We see that science is very much done by multifunctional teams. So we also need in all those teams the knowledge of how to handle data. So all staff should be trained there. And we contribute a bit. We have, for instance, the research data management skill program, and people get an accreditation there as well. We can also make it much easier to store the data, because if you're a scientist and you have the data, but you don't really know how to share it. So there's a program here with Mendeley. And then it's, I have to emphasize, it's very easy for to emphasize, to talk about transparency, but there are lots of players involved here. So it's not only the publishers, but you would like, this transparency to also then be picked up by many other players in this whole knowledge society, so to say. So finally, what I would hope actually is that the STM publishers where make this twist from discovering knowledge and now say it's all about trusting knowledge, and this trust is achieved through the importance of quality and transparency. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. I've got about 7 questions for you already myself. There's lots of things that you've raised there that I think really relate to the potential of what we can and can't do effectively. So I think we'll be coming back to those in the discussion. I can see people are already starting to ask questions, so please do start putting your questions in if you want us to get to them. But before I come to that, Marie, I'm really interested to know from you, as a journalist, where do you start asking questions about all of this?
So I've got lots of questions already for the other speakers. There's so many things that bubble up that you want to cover. And just speaking of how technology journalists cover data, big data, data analytics, it's changed a lot, I would say, even in the last 5 to 6 years. When I started out writing and covering these, I'd cover them from the perspective of I'd be interviewing a CEO or a CTO and asking about how cool the innovations were and how they worked. And now it's changed a little bit. I think in the last few years, particularly post Cambridge Analytica, which I think was this big tidal wave of quote unquote techlash, where a lot of general society start wondering, wait a minute, is this my personal data that big corporations or governments are using? How are they using it? How are they combining it? Which is really interesting when you see that there are third-party data brokers in the business of making millions off the back of your personal data, and they sell it on to everything from insurance companies to targeted ads that we see following us around the internet. So it's really interesting to be a technology journalist right now, actually, because you do feel that whole notion of the fourth estate, where you make sure that you uphold that idea of reporting to the public what they need to know and what they demand to know. And in terms of data, that comes down to, I suppose, maybe I'll refer to, Peter talked about, you mentioned the black box. That's something that we now talk a lot about in technology journalism, where people often wonder how these algorithms work, what kind of data goes in, how is the data cleaned, how is it combined, and what kind of algorithms are applied to it to get the decisions that come out the other end of this black box. But somebody working in Google, there's not one person in Google that even knows how the search algorithm works, because it's so huge and complex and has grown and been added to over the years that it's distributed knowledge. There isn't a human that can understand this system. So when you see the complexity of the data modeling that's happening, you're wondering, how are we meant to understand that? And how is the public meant to understand that? And I guess what it comes down to as well is that at the very least, people are starting to demand transparency. They're starting to ask, and that's something actually that obviously Michael was talking about quite a lot as well. How do we know how these things work and how our data goes into it? And I keep saying our, and of course, often what I'm really talking about and what's most relevant to the average, person who reads the news and uses technology, they're often seen not as citizens but as users of a platform or a service. And I think that's something, it's interesting because you wonder what that means to be a user of technology. It should extend to data ethics, where you're a citizen and your data is applied in an ethical fashion to whatever is being used. So yeah, I think there's lots of interesting things here. And Peter touched upon pseudo objectivity as well. And I thought that was really interesting, that a lot of people separate a technology or an algorithm from the humans that develop it and that feed the data into it. And we often think algorithms are these kind of, there's a certain element of magical thinking that goes on, where you think that it's a fuzzy little magic box that is objective and does it right because it's a computer, it's ones and zeros, it's binary, and it can't make mistakes, it's not flawed. And we know that bias in, bias out, BIBO, that's one thing that we kind of talk about a lot more, that I think the average reader is starting to understand. These are not magic systems that work perfectly, and they often can draw bizarre conclusions. There's one really good example. It's called the chocolate serial killer study. The University of Edinburgh, they basically found a correlation between the amount of chocolate consumption per capita and the amount of serial killers per capita. And the countries that have more chocolate consumption have more serial killers, and therefore correlation equals causation. If you eat a lot of chocolate, you're going to be serial killer. So that's the kind of bizarre results that can be spat out of these black boxes. So when we see that, and then we see that these algorithms and the data that backs them are being used to determine the recidivism, and if somebody goes back into prison, and even counts as a score towards if they're going to get parole or not, or if they'll get bail, which is happening in America with systems that have been sold to police forces in various states. That's starting to worry people, that these systems, that we can't, it's not human thinking. These are just rules that are applied to data, and we don't know that what comes out the other end is actually making sense, like the chocolate serial killer. And we don't want that to happen in broader society. And then you have, GCSE results being determined by algorithms modeled on data, and you wonder, is this actually fair? And Cosmina, actually, you talked about if you're underrepresented in the data, you're underrepresented in the risk, and vice versa. I thought that was really interesting because it reminded me of the complaints that these predicted scores from GCSE marks. They were saying that children in schools that were, more economically underserved, perhaps, or in areas that are, demographics where they're socioeconomically, they're not doing as well as other schools, they're going to be predicted to have worse results. And that's something that is very worrying, that by virtue of being in a certain zip code, or by virtue of being a certain gender or ethnicity, that the data will make these correlations and decide this is what it means to be you, and this is how we'll apply this algorithm to you. So yeah, sorry for meandering into that area, but it's very interesting because it happens every day. If we look at, and I'm not trying to pick on Google, but it's just so ubiquitous. But if you, it's since been fixed when people pointed it out, but it had been the point a few years ago where if you Googled professional hair, the Google image results would come back overwhelmingly a majority of white people. And if you Googled unprofessional hair, the majority of images that were returned were of people of color. And that is something that would make your blood boil, knowing that the data, it's, rubbish in, rubbish out. So we need to see how that data is being applied. Yeah.
Wow, thank you, Mary. That's brilliant. Yeah. And I think really underlines the challenges. I mean, just all those ways in which you have to approach and think about this underlines the challenges, because you've actually outlined things which are quite specific to big data science, but also some real old chestnuts that have frustrated us for years. So the cause and correlation, I was thinking also when Cosmina was presenting, Cosmina, in some ways, we're kind of coming up against things that people tried methodologically to solve in the past. And then we're suddenly encountering them again. I mean, this issue of looking down the wrong end of the telescope when you have problem behavior, for example, and imagining that all of the factors, I mean, we've had this, we had a famous case in the UK of a guy called Michael Ryan who went round shooting up a community, and people then looked at, and we get this now in the States as well with the shooter stories, people then look at all the things that led to Michael Ryan becoming someone who would, shoot randomly at communities. And all of those things then, of course, become factors. Or similarly, we find it with hard drug use. People then look at the fact that most hard drug users, or people with a serious drug use problem, started out using other drugs and less commonly. And so they then imagine that there's an inevitable pathway from soft drug recreational use to hard drug use. And so this sort of thing is not an age-old problem, but in a way, data science, as Peter was saying, kind of, it's almost like we give things the veneer of being so much more accurate that we're reinventing old problems as well as some of the new problems. Cosmina, that's kind of what you were describing to me?
Yeah, to some extent, and I think I mean, another problem that you know, we haven't really touched upon is that when you talk about data, when you talk about people, you absolutely need a multidisciplinary approach, and you need domain expertise. What the domain experts do is basically tell you there should be no link between chocolate and serial killers, and that should be taken out. But the field of data science has been the field of computer scientists, you know, has been the field of the sort of, you know, technology companies of the world. While the field of human behavior has been the field of the social sciences. And these two need to come together for us to start to make some sense of this new world. And I think the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that we look at sort of success stories like medicine, for example. And you can say, you know, you can build a machine learning algorithm that predicts a personalized treatment plan. And I think, I mean, that's very difficult to do. But what's even more difficult is to look at that and to say, because we can predict personalized treatment plans in medicine, we can predict personalized treatment plans in children's social care or in the criminal justice system, mostly because you don't have like a very precise target variable. With medicine, you know, the target is being free of disease, so you have something to optimize over. With reoffending risk or you know, putting a child in care, what do you optimize over? You know, what is the optimal outcome, and how can you account for all the sort of positive interactions that people have? You know, it's not a linear sort of clear-cut rule, and this is where we need so much more work, and so much more work from across the disciplines, not just in terms of, you know, how do you actually write the algorithm? How do we make sense of human behavior?
And that is asking something of policy, isn't it? Because for policymakers need to ask good questions too of the research. You know, the onus is still there on formulating a good question and knowing what it is you're looking for if you want the science to be good. I can just see this campaign that we want to start, you know, the placard, domain expertise now or something is what we're going to be looking for. Peter, I mean, that's kind of a similar point, isn't it? That the downplaying of domain expertise was what I think you were referring to a bit in your comments about human judgment and the way that we imagine we can do without that now because, right, data solves everything. That's been the UK's approach.
Well, I think that's a large part of the problem. And I think that what's happened is, as Cosmina's just said, the people who basically drive big data are coming from a field often not understanding the nuances that are necessary to actually understand how people live in this world. And I mean, even in the issue of medicine, we've known a lot for a long time that evidence-based medicine works well within very narrowly constrained situations, but like a choice of treatment or in very well-designed, well-defined disease. But once you move beyond that into more contextually variable situations, evidence-based medicine has its weaknesses. So we've got to be very careful. None of this is new. I think Tracy made the point. None of this is new. We've just created a bigger black box in which issues of poor experimental design in one way or another and poor analytical techniques emerge, and lack of transparency leads to lots of other issues. One of the issues we've not discussed, which I think is relevant, particularly in the COVID situation, is the issues of social license, the issues of who has the data, who ultimately controls it. And we've seen that coming to the fore in the debate over whether contact tracing applications, apps can be developed, how they'll be developed, and a lot of controversy in different countries over that. And to the extent that in some countries it's likely that the lack of proper oversight over these issues is going to impede the use of technologies which actually could potentially be useful in impeding the pandemic. New Zealand has a lot of experience in this because 5 years ago, New Zealand was the world leader in thinking about large databases, the integrated data infrastructure, as it was called, which were going to be used to test a lot of questions in social policy. The issues of incomplete social license have greatly reduced the ability of that system to be useful for policy making. A great opportunity lost because social license wasn't first achieved. And there've been survey recently, and we had done surveys in New Zealand, and I see Imperial College has just recently released a report showing that in general, publics have less trust in government having their data, than they have in the private sector having their data. And that is a worrying signal about the relationship between citizens and those who govern them across the democratic world. And I think so there is some broader issues here, which I know are outside the mainstream of this particular discussion, but they're not entirely independent of it.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And doesn't help when you have situations as we've had in the UK where government was seeking to procure a model for COVID. And went, I think, to about 12 different providers asking for a COVID model. And of course, they all ended up having to say, well, actually, no, you can't build one because we haven't got any data to build it with. That's why we ended up looking at flu, and just that basic misunderstanding among people who are self-proclaimed advocates of the use of data in decision-making in the UK government. And they're making such fundamental errors of approach, which is kind of, doesn't enhance public trust and confidence in that process at all.
A very simplistic example of that, a very simplistic model, are the models that were produced, say, by The Economist to produce global preparedness for the pandemic, which rated on, because you mold in a non-scientific way a whole lot of different factors together, and you came out saying the United States, the United Kingdom were the best prepared countries in the world for the pandemic in 2019. We all know what happened subsequently. And so I think it's just a simplistic example of when the nuances of understanding the system in play require more than just picking something off the shelf.
Yeah. So the other side of this is, of course, having a lot of stuff that's not relevant. So we've talked a bit about missing things out or becoming simplistic, but the other side, I mean, Michiel, you've outlined, kind of making everything available, a world in which everything is there. And surely in that you are looking at usage and you are looking at actually what is useful and how people are using it as well. Because I think, I suppose there's a certain strand of people who think it's fantastic. We've got so much data available. We must surely be able to know everything then, right? And a good example of that is people think that because we have, for example, real-time transport data, we know exactly what's going on in the world, and forget that actually real-time transport data is stuff that's already happened, right? It's still stuff, anything that we are recording is still stuff that's already happened. And we need actually to understand with some intelligence the way that this might serve a purpose. So presumably that intelligent thinking is a part of this too, right? In what you're doing with research. It isn't just a flood of stuff, surely.
No, but first, if you take the narrow perspective of research, we do see that scientists that publish not only an article, but an article with the data sets, that those articles are cited more and are read more. So there's a clear incentive for scientists to do so. And that's within their own sphere. But of course, that data is also of interest outside of the science community. But I think you're absolutely right. It's very difficult if you do not know, and I think we talked about it in the introduction, the right context of the data set, the provenance of the data set, that if you cannot interpret it right, it will not be meaningful. But the fact that you have to choose between data not being available or being available, we go for transparency and say, yes, the data must be available, and preferably it must be easy to find, and it also must make sense. So it must have the right metadata and to provide the right context.
Right. We have, between us all, flagged up so many things that we need. We use this word need all the time. We need to know this, we need to know this, we need to ask this, and we need to check that. And without someone like Marie showing up, or without someone like Peter being there in every, government decision-making process being established, how are we going to make sure that people are asking those questions? That they are saying what context was this produced in, and so on. As a society, surely we need to be asking those questions. And what can we do? Because that seems to me to be ultimately a key here, that we should be insisting. Now, there's so much that providers can do, and I think, Michael, you hinted that providers should be talking more about quality control, right? As we've encouraged you to talk about peer reviews many years ago, we pushed and pushed for the publishers to talk about peer review. And because you talk about peer review, amazingly, afternoon radio shows ask researchers, and is it peer reviewed? Which is a start, right? So what's our equivalent?
Brilliant. I'm very happy. And every time I heard it during the COVID crisis, where, the journalist from a regional, newspaper who said, but is this based on a peer-reviewed study or something? I was like,
yeah. Do you know what? It was in The Simpsons. It was in The Simpsons. Is it peer reviewed? Right. That means we made it. But so what is our equivalent here? I mean, Peter, you're in this situation. That as someone who was advising government, sometimes you were in the room at the right time. You could catch this stuff. But surely it needs to be institutionalized a little bit more. This questioning culture. What can we do?
Well, I think there's even deeper issues. I think we need to if you think about non-big data science, whatever we call traditional science modalities, it's really only in the last few years that we begin to ask questions truly of reproducibility, truly of experimental design, the disease of p-hacking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really only in the last decade that that's coming to any sort of surface. And I think that that's needed people who STS scholars and other forms of scholars looking at science as much as it leads scientists from the natural scientists, shall we say, looking at themselves. Now, I think we're at the beginning of the same set of issues now exist with a very different modality of doing science. All said and done, ultimately, big data in its various forms is not hypothesis driven. I know somebody's going to shoot me for saying that, but it's effectively a random way of assessing data sets for patterns, and then seeing if to what extent they match reality as it's perceived.
Well, this is a good
so that I think that we are yet to define what the culture of good big data science is, and it has a whole infrastructure that doesn't really exist, perhaps outside genetics and perhaps outside big physics. And they are issues of the costs and the structure of data curation and all the elements of data curation that need to go on to produce a good data set. And particularly when data sets are amalgamating different sources into giant mega data sets done from different countries, different laboratories, we need to work through the processes, and it has a cost structure to it. And so the cost of doing big data science, good big data science, is different to the cost of previous forms of science, where much of the cost is not actually in the data collection, but actually in the data curation, storage, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a whole lot we've got to learn here, which we're rushing to use without thinking through all the issues. Some of the issues that Cosmina raised, some of the issues that Marie raised. We've got to work it through to a culture and a discipline of big data science from its collection to its use.
Well, we have a question on it. We have a question related to this that I'll put to you. And Michael, I'm going to come to you on that question of curation in a moment. But we have a question on to the panel about how big data on the social determinants of health can be used to improve decision making. And I just, when you're talking about data mining, I mean, and finding patterns, this is kind of prime territory, isn't it?
Of course it is. But then you've got to say, is it deterministic or is it hypothesis generating to then do the appropriate kinds of studies to validate it. I mean, it's the jump from a pattern. It's the old causation correlation story in a different way. Right. And again, you cannot jump from correlation to causation without testing the hypothesis. Ultimately, I think we're going to find that is necessary. It may require new ways of doing it, but claiming that just big data alone can find the causation pathway as opposed to just association pathways is something that in itself is a very black box argument.
Okay. Cosmina, are researchers guilty of actually feeding this rather than sort of developing that critical questioning? Cosmina,
I would prefer to think not, and that's certainly not what we're trying to do. Just to go back to the question in terms of what can be done, I think institutions like the Turing and the public policy program that it has been very helpful, and a lot of countries are sort of looking at us as a model. The reason why is that you have a national institute that can draw on the expertise of 13 universities across all domains. And you have a one-stop shop for the government to come and ask those questions in a sort of from an independent, trusted advisor. And this is what happens. We probably have hundreds of policymakers coming to us and asking us those questions, not just on the technical side, but also on the ethical side. And a lot of what we do, we can't talk about. A lot of what we do, we don't get thanks about. But, whenever somebody is thinking about something, they do come and we do ask them those questions. Whether they take them on or not isn't dependent on us, and sometimes they don't come to us ask questions. We haven't heard about the off-call algorithm before it was implemented, and that's a shame because that's a resource that they would have had they opted to use it. Yeah. And I think we're also, what we're trying to provide is we wrote the public sector's guidance on the ethical use of AI in the public sector. And it's the most comprehensive guidance there is in the world. We work with the Information Commissioner's Office to produce joint guidance on explainability. Those are topics that policymakers are starting to look into. They don't have the expertise internally to do it. I don't think private providers are necessarily the answer, and I think they do need a trusted advisor, and I think that need investment.
Yeah, but that is still rather a narrow and fairly technical conversation that goes on. I mean, if I look in the UK situation, or actually the EU level, it's still a discussion that only concerns certain sectors, for example, of the Commission. It's not the sort of stuff that you're talking about there with the guide to the public sector. It's not a conversation that's yet happening with people who it should be happening with. It's still something that the Joint Research Centre, for example, is having in one of its sort of strands of consideration. It's still a highly specialised conversation, and we're now talking about things being rolled out in a much broader context. So I think we need to think about a more popularising kind of awareness. Just as in, we all understand something about in our countries about the Constitution. We might not be constitutional historians or experts. Those people debate the inner workings of the Constitution, but we all have some idea that we have one or we don't, and what it stands for. And I think that's what we need, some kind of broader uplift in society to do this. But in order to do that, Cosmina, did you want to say something on that?
I mean, I absolutely agree. And our experience at the Turing has been, we've ran a number of citizen juries, including with the ICO when we're working our guidance on explainability. And they have been tremendous for us to witness and to watch, because you basically take people, your average person, and you educate them on this for a week, and they come up with brilliant answers, and better than us we would be able to come up with as researchers. But the idea is, who can provide that week of training on a sort of population-wide level, so they can be asking the right question, and they can be deciding what needs to happen with their data, and whom they want to sell it to, and whom they want to take money from. But yeah, absolutely. No, I agree.
Well, I'm a big fan of that. It's exactly what we do at Sense About Science. All our stuff's written by public consultation. But I love that stuff. Michiel, but first you guys have got to sort out what you want to say about curation, right? You've got to sort out what story you need to tell. What are the quality markers? That's something you're still exploring, isn't it?
Yes. Well, and there are a few aspects why it really makes sense to have all data, available and transparent. And one is it's all about the reproducibility, and that is extremely important in science because you can then truly trust the outcomes, right? You don't want one experiment which gives a certain prediction and then it cannot be reproduced. So what do you do with such experiment? And that links to a broader discussion of trust overall. And it also has to do with efficiency. So because the data is not out there, lots of scientists start from scratch, while they could actually be building on data sets already freely available. And if we can make science only like 10% more efficient, so to say, I mean, that is an incredible gain. Because overall, the amount that goes in, say, scientific research is impressive and rightfully so. But just imagine if we could kind of make that process more efficient, because all data sets are freely available and can also be understood by others because they have the right metadata, they have the right descriptions. But I'm with you. It would be really, really good that if we have this discussion in 5 years, that the understanding there is for peer review for articles should be completely be there, also peer review for data sets. And people should then know as scientists, I will not be successful to publish my results, which will then be not just a paper, it sounds completely outdated, but also, the underlying data sets. If I don't go through that data peer review process. So I think that would be excellent. And at the same time, I realized the peer reviewers would kill me because it's a job and a half, right?
Yeah, and we both know that if we set that as a plan, for the next 10 years, there'll be amazing conferences all about it. And all sorts of compacts will be agreed and signed, and no one will do anything different. But what about if you were to encourage, because this is exactly where peer review came from, if you were to actually encourage a critical engagement with those data that you're publishing? I'm thinking here, with Sense About Science runs the Global All Trials campaign, where we get clinical trials results published. And when GlaxoSmithKline finally, put all their stuff up and they invited other companies to do the same, people started joining that. One of the biggest things we learned was not the results of all these trials. I mean, we got that was okay. But the biggest thing was methodologically how flawed some of those trials were, and people had a really, really useful public conversation about a bad way to run a trial. Yeah. Why would you ask a question that your trial's not even statistically powered to answer? And all that, what a waste of money that is. That was a great narrative, because from that has come a much more kind of, I wouldn't say popularized in the way that Sense About Science means it, because we deal with communities, in the broadest sense, but much more open conversation that is trickling out into journalists and others about bad experimental design. You should be encouraging people to get stuck into these data, not just to use them, but to criticize and to improve on how they're gathered, right?
Yeah. And that is, of course, a cornerstone of open science, where science goes outside just science being produced for science, but it's science produced for society. And so what you just mentioned about clinical trials was not only experts talking to experts, but it was all of a sudden you kind of opened up this whole discussion, right? And citizens who were interested joined that conversation and contributed. So, and thank God there is a very strong open science movement, especially here in Europe, that is picking up speed more and more. And that's,
yeah, but still quite specialized. We've still got to kind of push it out there into the realms of what Peter was talking about, which is, it's into the realms of policy decision-making, reporting on that decision-making and accountability and so on. Before we, I do want to go into this a bit more, this whole question of transparency and reflection and whether we need standards. Is standards the way to make this happen? I'm going to come to that. But I did want to ask Marie, you talked about techlash, the kind of backlash against the sort of the hype, as it were. But tech wash, there may have been a bit of a kind of period of tech wash when we heard that it was going to solve everything, and maybe we've had a backlash against that in the public domain. But it still sounds, from all the examples that we've been discussing here and others that people have raised with us in the questions, that you stick the kind of big data bit on it and the black box around it, and you can drive a coach and horses through some of those integrity questions that you would normally expect journalists to ask. It seems like that tech wash works, and you still get the kind of awe and wow from journalists.
Yeah, personally, I think we've been indoctrinated. If you look at the roots of technology journalism, and everybody probably remembers every time something, like from the time the iPhone came out in 2007, or was it 2008, to every subsequent release of a piece of tech from Apple, the Apple fanboy and fangirl, you saw where it was like seeing the Rolling Stones play or something. It was just all of these journalists clapped and screamed like teenagers when this big tech guru came on stage. And of course, the narrative is going to be, what's this golden god going to bestow upon us next? So this is where you've kind of opened up that, like I said, that how it's been framed. Yeah, you can probably tack anything onto it and we'll accept it. I think our eyes have been collectively opened now. But if you were to go back, please don't, and read my writing when I started out, I was very much a fangirl. It was frothy, bubbly. This is amazing. I was so excited, and now it has snapped round to, the veil has been lifted. These tech companies hold data power. Whoever has the data has the power, and they have the power much more than any government agency. The collective amount of data and insights into that data that Facebook or Google or any of those big companies have, Microsoft, whoever it is, it's staggering. And I think we've started to wake up to that now. I hope, because if you look at science communication studies looking at how the public perceives emerging technologies, time and again, they'll just show that they mostly get it through, it's a mediated version. It's a mediated explanation of these technologies. They don't tend to go to, open access journals and read it. The average member of the public doesn't. They go on social media, they flick through papers, they turn on the radio and the TV. So we are the gatekeepers of how society should hold anyone who has data accountable to how they apply that data. And I think we're starting to see maybe a bit more responsibility. I know at the end of the day, journalists also are looking to, the organizations are looking to make a profit. So we can't forget that either. We're not these, amazing people who come along and are totally objective. We are looking for a hook. We're looking for a story. And often sensationalized versions of things can happen too. So you should take all that into account and journalistic accountability. But yeah, I think maybe it's turning a little bit. There is a bit of a turning point.
Yeah, and let's not forget that your job as journalist is also to report the opportunity.
Absolutely.
And even if people are in it to make a profit or whatever, in anything, I mean, there are good things that happen, and sometimes innovation is required, and you're not going to get innovation, as I think Cosmina would probably tell you, working in areas of public policy. I mean, sometimes it takes that kind of push, even if something coming from outside isn't quite right. But you sometimes need those innovations too to push.
Oh, absolutely. I still get so excited about new innovations. It's just now I stop and ask questions. I don't just rush with the report of how amazing it is. I do stop and ask, wait, what does this mean for the average citizen? And are there any ethical implications? Is this safe? So we now are looking at risk as well as reward. I think it was more reward for risk was an afterthought.
Okay, so what you're reminding me of is that back in the 1980s, where I was kind of doing stuff then, and you probably weren't, but back in the 1980s, which I do remember, the consumer movement was big, right? And we didn't have such consumer standards. It's kind of got really going in the 70s, and then the 80s really took off. So that popularly, I think in most developed countries, the idea that I have rights as a consumer really took off. And we had standards. We don't really know what they are, but we feel like we have rights to them. And there was a set of journalists who reporting on all these great new whizzy contraptions and things that, you know, machines that we were having into our household. So, you know, labor-saving devices and all sorts of other, I mean, it was the beginning of tech. But it wasn't nearly the kind of tech you're talking about. But it was the beginning of tech, some of which worked, some of which blew up, some of which, you know, was inordinately expensive. And people were beginning to kind of understand there was something that you could go to as a standard, right? So I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking, on the other hand, I'm listening to all the complexity of what Peter's describing and what Michael's describing, the research community, and what Cosmina says, you know, is that we're at the start of quite a long path. And so is it too early for us to expect standards? We've got this kind of challenge between, we need it because stuff is being rolled out at pace, but we can't really start putting standards in place and saying, you should expect as a journalist to have this answer to this question. You should expect this quality standard because it's so innovative and there are so many purposes, so much different weight. I mean, Cosmina, are we too early for standards?
I think we definitely need to think very carefully about the ethical implications of our work. And I think there needs to be limits on, you know, what we can use those technologies for. And we need to have those discussions as a society and decide, you know, there are a lot of sort of gray areas. Just to give you a recent example, there's a recent research showing that spelling mistakes on credit applications indicate a higher risk of default. Should credit companies be using that? You know, I mean, that's not personal information they're collecting about us. That's something that we do when we fill out a form. So there are lines there. And I think we need to clarify what those lines are. Of course, you know, you want to stimulate innovation. You want projects to take off. You want people to experiment. But before they deploy them in the wild where it actually affects people's lives, we need to have some sort of limits on that, I think.
Right. Peter, New Zealand's going down the standards route for procurement. Peter? You're on mute, Peter.
That's a simple example. I mean, where Cosmina was going is procurement is one thing, but I think the application to decision-making that affects people's lives is something where we still have to explore what I think are the two components that we don't parse out separately. One is how big data derived interpretations fits with other sources of evidence to be synthesized in evidence synthesis. That the second component is then how that synthesized interpretation is then transmitted to the policymaker and the publics in a way that says these are the options that are ahead. This is the evidence that supports one option or another option. And I think we're still at that early stage of thinking about when you have a big data position, a pattern identified from big data, and you have other forms of data or evidence, how that all gets pulled together to make decisions. And in a sense, we've been rushing through that in COVID in many different ways. And we've seen in the different COVID responses around the world, the struggles between data, models, observation, no matter how robust or not it is, incomplete science, and yet governments have to make urgent decisions. And different decisions have been made by different governments in different contexts. And I think while it's a very acute and specific experiment, or I'm not sure experiment's the right word, occasion, I think it's a microcosm of the bigger issues around how big data, uncertainty, other sources of evidence come together to make decisions. And we've got a long way to learn about this. I think when we stand back and look in 5 years' time and we're doing a lot of work trying to collect the data for later research, how decisions were made in the COVID situation, we'll explore a lot about how data are integrated with other sources of evidence. You're muted now.
Michael, what do you think about this? I mean, curation is obviously a big part of your thinking here.
Yes. So, but I think if data is freely available, people will be scrutinized by it. And so, for instance, in the scientific world, I mean, would I, as a scientist, really want to take the risk that other people see the data and I know it's not really up to the right standards? So I think that will already make a big difference, especially because you'll be scrutinized by your peers, right? Say you're an astronomer and you get your hands on another astronomical data, you will have a field day with that data, and if it turns out something is flawed there, it will come out. So in that sense, openness is really, really good. So I'm not talking about public shaming here, but it's because this is something you can all learn from each other as well. So I think that would definitely help to raise the quality of data.
What you are talking about is jeopardy. Jeopardy is a really powerful thing, and I think actually it's one of those things that people misunderstand. They think that peer review is all about reviewers spotting flaws, and indeed that happens. They spot flaws, things get fixed. I'm sure most papers are much more readable as a result of peer review. However, it's the anticipation of your peers looking at what you do that already disciplines your behavior. So I guess, I can see that. I can see that there is that limit that gets placed. And maybe we need jeopardy. Maybe we need that sunlight of transparency could suddenly be shone on your data, and you should pick out a random, like the Hunger Games, but for data, we pick out 100. I don't know, but something. Maybe
data scientist. Okay.
That wasn't an idea I expected to suggest in this session. But I do think where you're all going, and I'm going to just give you 30 seconds to kind of say, is this really our next step, or do we ask more? But what you all seem to be saying, we're at a stage where we just need to get people getting to the point of saying, yeah, we just need to ask more questions. It sounds good, but there's more to this. It's not as simple as just telling us what decision to make. So is that kind of what we're saying here? We just need to get people. Can we just have everybody's kind of a show of hands, final comment, please? Michael, I'll start with you. I'm going to cut you all off after 20 seconds because we won't have more.
Yes, I completely agree. At the same time, I think we should definitely also invest that the general public has a higher understanding of data science, data implications, and the role of science journalists is crucial here.
Okay, Marie, that's your cue.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to give an example. The Irish Times teamed up with a university in Ireland to get everybody involved in open or in citizen science, and it was really cute. They got people to look at your cat, look at the neighboring cats. What kind are they? They ticked off boxes, and then they created this big survey. It was interactive. Everybody felt like they'd put their data into it, and it was something interesting. It was their own pet. They were really excited, and so people got to see through something fun and interactive how data science and open science actually works. So initiatives like that's something like like a big broadsheet or a TV station, if they can connect the public to research institutes, I want to see more of that.
More of them, great. Peter,
Well,
your 10 seconds.
My own view is that we shouldn't put this on big data on such a pedestal that it undermines other sources of evidence and information that comes together. And I would make a plea for one word: transdisciplinarity. I would make a plea that we see big data as part of the toolkit that should be properly engaged in transdisciplinary research, where we frame the questions in a pluralistic way, and we focus on the outcomes that we want to achieve. And
okay.
I think
Thank you. I'm going to come to Cosmina. I don't know how I'm going to get that on a placard for the campaign. We need a new word. Cosmina,
I think that's it's a good place to end on, because I agree with Peter, and I think what we're going to find out about COVID in 5 years' time is that the thing that we have been missing is integrated models. We have epidemiological models and economic models, and these are not communicating. And just the gains that you can get from that, and we're starting to look at that in the Turing are huge. But I definitely agree with Peter. We need to bring it all together.
And we need to be sharing more of these dilemmas with a bigger part of society, right? They are too exclusive at the moment. So thank you all for joining us. Wonderful panel, wonderful discussion. This has been Data Revolution, and we're now going to go and lead the question revolution. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.